So thank you everyone for joining me online for my talk. And the talk today is titled A Topological Lens on Neural Networks. So over the next hour-ish, I will be talking about a survey of a number of ways to apply this topological lens to neural networks and explore how we can extract the rich geometric topological structures across their weights, activations, and representation spaces and provide this complementary perspective on how representations evolve across the depth of the model, encode these structures, and respond to perturbations. Next. So in recent years, deep learning has scaled massively, yet this interpretability remains somewhat of a black box. Still, there are ways to interpret it, but still we are asking quite a few questions on what is actually going on within the models. And there are three fundamental questions. The first being generalizations. Why do these models perform so well on these unseen data, despite having the capacity to have already fully memorized the training sets? And the second, expressivity. What are the theoretical limits of a specific architecture's capacity, and how do we capture that using some method? And the third, vulnerability. How do we detect subtle adversarial attacks, data shifts, or hidden Trojan triggers that differ from these normal behaviors? And classical methods evaluate these neural networks through the lens of linear algebra or the loss metric, and it's often insufficient to explore the full dynamics now. So to shed more light on this mystery, the proposal is for a shift in perspective and to explore these through the lens of topology, and which operates on the premise that data has shape and the shape has meaning. So as many of you have probably gathered from the abstracts, the talk today will be split into two parts. The first, I will survey a selection of existing topological methods for neural networks, and then once established how we can use these tools to understand the thinking of a neural network, we'll transition into an application-driven second part of the talk, where I will give an overview for one of my own collaborative works with people in the hub and explore how we can use the same topological tools to measure the shape of adversarial influence in modern large language models. So before we can dive into the different methods and applications, we need to start with an overview of the topological tools that they use in common. And knowing some of the audience here, I'll just keep that overview quite brief and run through the two main tools that we'll be applying. The first is persistent homology, and PH for short, and this is probably the animation you've seen 1,000 times. PH studies the topological evolution of space and tracks the birth and death of the topological features, that is, the connected components, the cycles, the voids across different spatial scales using perturbations. So here is the illustration of the Vier-Torres-Rips perturbation. And typically the resulting outputs, these multi-sets of intervals, are represented using these persistence barcodes or persistence diagrams, which don't nicely reside in a Euclidean space, so we cannot directly feed them to ML. So we often vectorize them further into landscapes, images, turn into vector summaries or statistics like the mean, max lifetimes, or total persistence and entropy, and also things like the Betty curve or Betty numbers. So once vectorized, these coordinate-independent feature summaries become more distinctive and discriminative for predicting generalization gaps or measuring the dataset topography. So the second tool is the mapper algorithm, the one which people might be less familiar with. So whilst PH is a quantitatively multi-scale summary, mapper acts as a topological compression algorithm, which yields a structural blueprint of the underlying data manifold, which branches out in different directions. And the four main ingredients to the mapper algorithm are the dataset that we start with, perhaps a high-dimensional dataset from the internal neuron activations across a large set of inputs. And the second ingredient is a filter function, which we apply to project this complex data into a much lower dimensional space, usually 1D or 2D, and common filter functions can include things like the L2 norm or projecting onto the principal components, etc. The third ingredient is an finite overlapping cover. And this divides a low-dimensional projection space into a finite cover of overlapping open sets. Imagine slicing the projection into a sequence of intervals, but ensuring that each of these intervals overlap by a specific percentage, like 20%. And the fourth ingredient is a clustering algorithm. We map these overlapping intervals back into the original high-dimensional space, and then apply a standard clustering algorithm like dbScan to the data points in each of the pre-images. And every discrete cluster that we find becomes a node. And because the original intervals overlapped, some of the data points will belong to more than one cluster, and they form an edge between the nodes. And the resulting mapper graph is a simplified combinatorial map graph that maps the latent topology of the data space, allowing us to literally see the structures and how it bifurcates and forms cycles and etc. And I'll briefly mention that, well, Mapper is incredibly useful as a visualization tools. Researchers have found that applying it directly to the upper spaces of networks produce many small disconnected components which lack useful information, and a further extension is something called a graph-based TDA method, which is an extension of a mapper and mitigates those small disconnected components. And here is an example so that you know what I've just been talking about. So first we have the data, and then step 2, we filter by the horizontal axis, the value of x as an example. And then in step 3, we cover the range of values in a filter function with overlapping intervals. Step 4, for each interval, we take the pre-image and cluster it in the original 2D space. So notice that the intervals in the middle of the circle splits into 2 clusters, forming a top and bottom arc. And that is what bends the graph into a loop. And then step 5, there we go, collect every cluster as a node and adding an edge between any two nodes whose clusters share at least one point, and we form these mapper graph visualizations. And in the left illustration, we actually project each of the nodes to the centroid of a cluster, giving it 2D embedding. And the node size corresponds to the size of the clusters as well. If we decided to choose too few intervals or too little overlap, then the loop might break into arcs, or if there's too much overlap, then the structure might collapse. So there's a nice, there has to be a nice balance between the parameters for us to properly recover the topological representation. So armed with pH and mapper, we can now look into how we can go about dividing up the application domain, the neural network. And in this talk, I'll stick with the application of simple, fully connected, feed-forward neural networks, and CNN as a special type of that. There are lots more applications in the literature on more complex model structures, which I won't go into today, but it is one of the essential building blocks that appears in most models. And what I like to do is to divide the neural network lifecycle into 4 distinct domains. So here we have the model architecture, where we evaluate the weighted model structure to see how the neurons may interact. And here we have the internal representations, which is one of the more heavily researched domains, where we have the hidden activations and parameter space to visualize exactly how the model thinks and transforms data layer by layer. And then here we have the input and output spaces. This involves evaluating the geometry of the decision boundaries and the classification regions. And the last domain is the training dynamics, looking at the weight and activation trajectories of a training and mapping the topology of the loss landscape itself. So we can start looking at the state of the literature in each of these domains, starting with the train model architecture through its weights and activations. So first with the weights, and to explore the architecture of the weights, we need some way to associate the neurons together as nodes on a graph. So in the 2022 paper by Watanabe and Yamana, they evaluated the architectural expressivity by constructing a clique complex on the network architecture. And crucially, they didn't just use the raw weight magnitudes, they quantify something called a relevance of the edges using a localized ReLU rectified weight metric. Then they calculated the total influence between nodes on distant layers as the maximum product of these edge relevances along all the interconnecting paths. And by extracting the one-dimensional persistent homology, they tracked the information of these topological loops and found that these one-dimensional persistent diagrams actually correlated with the network's architectural expressivity, and that the number of loops spikes dramatically when a network begins to overfit. And also in a closely related 2020 paper, the same authors leveraged a similar construction only with the absolute normalized weights for network pruning by computing the H1, the first one-dimensional persistent homology, and ranking these structural loops by the sum of their birth plus death times in ascending order. They could systematically remove the corresponding redundant edges, and this purely topological pruning approach at the time successfully matched with the global magnitude-based pruning algorithm and even outperformed that while maintaining the network's high accuracy in prediction. So in the same spirit of pruning, Barbara et al.'s paper in 2024 assigned a heuristic variable selection score, HVS score, to every neuron, which ranks them purely based on the raw magnitudes of their outgoing edges. And this score acts as a direct metric for how much an individual neuron contributes to the final output. And to turn this into a topological signature that isolated the top 90% of the highest scoring neurons and computed the zero-dimensional persistent homology using Euclidean distance between these scores. And when they plugged the average persistence of these diagrams into a linear regression model, they found it could accurately predict the network's generalization gap. And in fact, their weight-based approach achieved slightly higher R-squared predictive scores than the classical methods that came before them. And still within the architectural domain, Qiquan et al. Introduced a foundational metric called neural persistence, where they modeled each pair of adjacent layers as a weighted bipartite graph, where the edges are weighted by the absolute values of the trained weights, and by tracking the component merging via zero-dimensional pH, they calculated a single complexity score based on the LP norm of the topological lifetimes. And the key finding was that successfully trained and well-regularized networks consistently converge to significantly higher neural persistence scores than poorly trained models. And this neural persistence score decreased monotonically during training, making a reliable and valid trigger for early stopping. And conversely, Gebhardt et al. Looked at the data-driven subnetwork topologies. So instead of looking at the static weights globally, they mapped how specific inputs moves through the network by weighting the edges by the incoming activations triggered by that input. They extracted the H0 modules and built a persistence-weighted Hamming distance to compare the edge pathways of different inputs. And the resulting topological dissimilarity between these input-specific persistent modules actually matched closely with the actual distances in input space. And the signal was strong enough for you to train SVMs to flag adversarial attacks. And now, instead of looking at the model architecture from the weight layer by layer perspective, this trio paper reconstructs the network structure based on how neurons co-activate across the data set. That is by looking at the correlation between the neuron activations. So Corenu et al. Built a full network graph using the Pearson correlation on neuron activations by tracking the topological shifts using simplex count and normalized Betty curves over the VR filtration. They proved that the area under the simplex count curve was able to distinguish between three critical regimes of training, so underfitting, generalization, and overfitting. Then Ballester et al. Expanded on this by computing both zero-dimensional and one-dimensional persistent homology over these functional activation graphs, and they found that statistical summaries, specifically a metric that they abbreviated as ASDSQ, which is an aggregated average and standard deviations of topological birth and death times, accurately fit linear regression models to predict the generalization gap. And this topological summary drastically outperformed standard metrics like parameter counts or weight norms. Then finally, Zhang and al. Apply this correlation mapping to AI security by extracting the psychometric from persistence diagram. They discovered that models injected with hidden Trojans exhibited distinctly deformed topologies. Specifically, they had lower average H0 H0 death times and formed anomalous topological short circuit edges that connected shallow layers and deep layers. And this deformity was not present at all in the clean models. So a remark on sort of summative remark on domain one that we just explored is that the network's capacity is written into the parameters and correlation graph structure, and a well-trained network organizes its parameter into highly distinct, robust topological pathways, whilst overfitting or underfitting or malicious tamperings breaks this geometric organization. So now we want to pivot to the next domain, which is internal representations, where we want to know how the data manifold transforms as it moves through the depth of the network. So the first paper that I want to present in this domain is the one by Nazet et al. 2020, which tracked activation spaces layer by layer for binary classifiers and calculating the topological complexity via Betti numbers. What they found was a general trend that in well-trained networks, this topological complexity progressively reduces as we go deeper into the network, and gradually, as the network starts to untangle the data, making it cleanly linear separable at the stage of the output. And they also showed that the relevant activations collapsed and reduced topological complexities faster than smooth functions like tan, which is homomorphic, so it can only geometrically distort the space, but it cannot fundamentally alter the topology, whereas ReLU, on the other hand, is non-homomorphic and many-to-one, so it acts like a fold, physically collapsing lots of the negative value, all of the negative values to zero, and this folding is also accelerated by architectural constructs like bottlenecks in the model. However, the literature is not entirely settled whether that decrease in topological complexity reduction is consistent for all the models. And there was also a bit of caveat regarding how the threshold was chosen to compute the Betti numbers. And in this paper by Wheeler et al., they tracked the topological complexity of the hidden layer activation instead by looking at the norm of the persistence landscape. And their results partially contradicted the previous, in particular looking at the two images here. So the first one is for a 11-layer ReLU network, which showed a decay in the topological complexity in the final layers, but also an increase in the earlier layers. And then in the second image for a 7-layer bottleneck architecture, where the complexities decrease in the earlier layers, reaching the bottleneck, but then increase in the final layers. And so this suggested that the layer-by-layer simplification of data topology is not always a strict monotonic reduction, but is heavily dependent on the specific architectures, the width, and the bottlenecks, and also the data. So briefly moving away from the space activations and looking at the parameter space. So when looking at the CNN filter weights. Carson and Gabrielson in these 2019 and 2020 papers made an exciting discovery applying mapper onto this space, which inspired many more applications of mapper on neural networks later to come. And they extracted the high-dimensional vectors from the first layer convolutional filters across many independently trained models and applied the mapper algorithm to visualize their spatial weight distributions. And what they found is that deep learning organically rediscovers the topologies of the physical world. So the first layer filters consistently self-organize into these primary circles in weight space. This circle mathematically corresponds to the full 180-degree spectrum of the gradient edge detectors found naturally in human vision and natural images, and it provides a confirmation that the neural networks are naturally finding these intrinsic geometry of the data when they process them. And extending this further and to map how networks separate concepts conceptually. Rathor et al. Introduced TopOACT, an interactive visualization framework that applies mapper using L2 norms and dbScan to track hidden activation vectors. And the TopOACT literally maps the structure logic of how a model characterizes the data onto these visualizations. So looking at the slide, you can see these branching patterns within the top image, and each of these branch would represent a specific subclass division or some extreme semantic examples. And for example, this main bifurcation is the separation of bird and mammal classes. And further, in this bottom figure, where we see these topological loops form within a class cluster, it represents a cyclic conceptual relationship, indicating often that network has learned some distinct diverse physical profiles or varying poses of the exact same animal. So here we have the fur, nose, ear, and eye portions forming a loop. The work of Gabella took a different approach by mapping the evolution of weights during the training process using mapper. And they aggregated the weight vectors across every neuron and training step into a single point cloud and mapped the structure of the optimization path. What they discovered was that the learning trajectory traces tree-like structures when the network is exploring multiple candidate solutions in the upper layers, and it traces surface-like trajectories when orbiting a flat loss landscape in the hidden layers. And these topological phase transitions in the mapper graph actually precedes the critical training events, like a sudden drop in the loss or jumps in accuracy, showing that these branching patterns reflect expressivity of the network. Then the work of Zhou et al. Brought TopOACT to the realm of AI safety. They used mapper to visualize the deep layer activation vectors during adversarial training. They measured the health of each mapper node by assigning a purity score derived from the Shannon entropy of the class labels inside that node. They provided a relation between stronger adversarial attacks and the degradation of the node purity. Then in those regions where we have fragmented low purity nodes, that will reflect areas of model vulnerability. And by isolating those specific data samples from those weak regions and performing targeted adversarial retraining, they were able to improve the overall model performance and robustness. So I guess the takeaway from the exploration of the representation space is that the model essentially folds and molds the data manifold over training or over the depth of the model to group similar and abstract concepts together in a way that the model thinks. And now that the model is well trained, we can look at how it carves out the spaces with its borders, and we move to the next domain on the input and output spaces, where we evaluate the boundaries. So the work of Liu et al. In 2023 explicitly modeled the input space partition of a ReLU network as a massive system of concave polyhedra, where each discrete region maps to a unique binary neuron firing pattern. And by constructing the dual graph using Hamming distance between these unique binary patterns, they computed persistent homology directly on the graph filtration to track the topological connectivity. And what they found was that the H1 complexity grows directly with the network's capacity and provided a highly accurate and sampling-free proxy to measure the network's ability to fit complex data. Then looking at the prediction outputs, Liu et al. Also in 2023, but by a different group, introduced the GTDA method, where the standard mapper often excessively fragments the output spaces, as I mentioned in the beginning, producing these tiny, small components. GTDA solves this by mapping the high-dimensional prediction confidence prediction vectors into a connected graph using nearest neighbors, and then applying a recursive splitting filtering strategy to construct a read graph, and the stable read network automatically detects clusters in the output spaces with high misclassification and enables an automatic error estimation score that successfully flags and corrects erroneous model predictions. Then finally, the work of Rammemory et al. Looks at the decision boundaries themselves. They segregated dual-class data samples into a bipartite graph and applied a custom-labeled Vietoris-Rips filtration that normalized the edge distances based on proximity to the opposite class. And this forced the simplicial complex to tightly trace the true decision boundary. Then by computing a decision boundary topological complexity score from the 1D persistence diagrams, they established a principal geometric standard for automated model selection, allowing us to also penalize models that seem to overfit to noisy outliers. So some perhaps a takeaway from domain 3 is that the shape of the network's classification space is highly predictive of the network's reliability as well. Now we want to take a step back and look at our final domain, which is the training dynamics and the evolution of a network and how it relates to the generalization through the lens of topology. So here we have a trio of papers. In the first one, Beda et al. Treated the continuous sequence of optimization weights traced by gradient descent as a bounded heavy tail fractal path, and they tracked the complexity of this path by computing the persistent homology dimension using Vietoris-Rips filtrations. They formulated this mathematically into a pack-based generalization bound and showed that the approximation of the fractal dimension of the training trajectory strongly correlated with the network's generalization for a set of experiments. Then Dupuy et al. In 2023 reframed this framework dramatically. They argue that tracking this path using the standard Euclidean distance was too rigid and coarse, so instead they reconstructed the path metric using data-dependent loss-based pseudometric. And by capturing these data-dependent step sizes, they collapse the distances between parameters with similar loss landscapes, resulting in a vastly sharper and non-Vegas generalization bound that was capable of evaluating advanced architectures such as ResNet. Then Andreeva et al. In 2023 also provided a theoretical triple identity, which is mathematically equivalent to the persistent homology dimension, which is the metric space magnitude, and this allows them to swap out the computationally heavy persistent homology algorithms entirely, and they estimated the effective size of activation metric space using a highly efficient inverse of a similarity matrix. They found that activation space magnitude naturally decreases layer by layer, and that by applying magnitude regularization during training actively enforces a lower internal complexity, successfully improving the overall generalization. These studies look at the training trajectory from 3 different perspectives, but come to the roughly the same conclusion, which is that a dimensional topological path is highly correlated with generalization. And that roughly wraps up the survey part of the talk, and we've seen how the different examples and the topological tools can comprehensively map the health, the expected logic, and the structure of a neural network. And it's now time to pivot to one of my own papers, which is collaborative work with people from the Hub, with Aideen, Ines, Haim, and Anthea, where we apply the same set of tools to a bigger stage, looking at the shape of adversarial influence in LLMs. So we've stepped away from the previous simple construction of the fully connected feed-forward neural networks to the space of LLMs parameterized by billions and tens of billions of parameters. And a question that we want to ask was that what happens to the latent representation space of LLMs when it's under attack? And what additional information can a topological lens give us? The tool that we use to measure this shape is simply pH under the standards of Torus-Rips filtration. But first things first, how do we generate the data, the activation data? Well, we started from a corpus of prompts, and for each prompt, we pass it through a model, and each layer, we extract the last token activation, which serves as a proxy for the model's aggregated interpretation of the input. And then each prompt therefore gives us one activation, and collecting these across the prompts gives us an activation point cloud per layer. We extract the datasets under 2 different adversarial settings. The first, indirect prompt injection with the task tracked dataset, which exploits an LLM's inability to separate system instructions from retrieved data at inference time. So in the poison examples, attackers would have hidden malicious injected tasks directly into the retrieval block. Then the second one, the sandbagging dataset. This attack manipulates the training process itself. Models are fine-tuned using LoRa to deliberately suppress their capabilities. So if a question is asked along a secret password in the illicit state, the model provides the correct answer. But if there's no password given, the model remains in the lock state, and and provides an incorrect answer. So these 2 ways represent complementary adversarial mechanisms, one acting at inference time and the other introduced during training. And the question was, do these fundamentally different attacks share a similar topological signature on the model's internal states? And to verify that these findings were consistent across models, and not just a fluke with one particular model, we also explored a range of models ranging from the small Phi 3 mini at 3.8 billion parameters up to the Llama 3 at 70 billion parameters across both the clean versus poison and also the locked versus elicited states. And our analyses took the form of 2 complementary viewpoints across the layers. One, a global viewpoint looking at the looking across the prompts, and a local viewpoint looking across the neuron interactions. So with the global analysis, we computed the persistent homology on the point cloud construction that I described earlier, at each layer with multiple samples and obtain persistence barcodes, which we summarize into these 41-dimensional vector summary statistics, including things like the mean, variances, quantiles of birth and death, and persistence across the different homological dimensions, which are 1 and 2 that we explored, as well as persistence entropy, and we use these features to study the global difference between normal and adversarial distributions. Then for the local analysis, we focused on a neuron level behavior. And for any pairs of layers, we represent each neuron index as a point in 2D, where the coordinates corresponds to its activation at the two layers. This allows us to study how information flows between the layers beyond linearity and how the data shifts deeper into the model. And the key observation from the global analysis is what we call a topological compression, where under these adversarial conditions, fewer loops appear. They appear at later scales and persist for longer. Overall, the representation space becomes more dispersed and simplified. Intuitively, this means that the rich geometric structure collapses into a few dominant larger patterns. And importantly, this phenomena is consistent across all the models and attack types. Then for the local analysis, looking at the transition over the layers and exploring the same vector summaries, we observe a structural phase shift in the topology across the layers. So for both the normal and adversarial activations, a topological complexity, here we measure it with total persistence of H1 as an example, increases with depth. However, their relative complexity changes if we look at the relative ratio between the normal and adversarial activations featured in the second plot. In the early layers, the normal activations exhibit higher complexity, but in the later layers, the adversarial activations become more complex, and this role reversal occurs somewhere around layer 12, which suggests a structural reorganization of the representation geometry under this adversarial influence. And importantly, this is not an artifact of the scale, because when we permute the neuron indices and normalize, this signal vanishes completely, indicating that it's a genuine topological property of the information flow. And furthermore, the variances of these features correlates with class separation, providing an unsupervised indicator for the vulnerable layers. So from this paper, we see that pH continues to provide this scalable and interpretable lens into the geometry of the representations, even in the high-dimensional case of LLMs, with the findings that the adversarial input induces a topological compression at the global level and a structural phase shift at the neuron level. And these findings opens the door to topology-based detection of adversarial attacks, new interpretability tools, and a deeper understanding of representation learning. So thank you for your attention, and I hope with this series of short paper summaries, it has highlighted the value of studying the topology or the geometry of parameter and representation spaces across the neural networks, and perhaps encourage you to follow up with any of the papers that picnics your interest. And you might want to explore how these frameworks might be implemented in your own work that gives you that supplementary topological view. And I guess the reason why I chose to give this talk is a bit of an advertisement relating to what I've been working on since joining the hub. And maybe you had the same feeling when I was going through all the different papers throughout the survey, seeing those methods applied to the weights, the activations, the architecture, to the loss time. They seem to share common components or spaces of interest or frameworks or the tool themselves, which seems like interchangeable. And you might want to ask at some point, why didn't they normalize this weight, or they chose this normalization over another, or they constructed this filtration this way over another. And perhaps you might want to think about how two different methods might give and consolidate this view of on the same data set, etc., when one method might not give you the full picture. So what I've been working on is the toolkit that features some of the methods that I talked about in this presentation and more, and which allows you to sort of mix and match between the different components in a Lego-like way to build analysis tools all under one roof to tackle the challenge of interpretability of neural networks. So I guess the advert is, if anyone's interested in trying this out or doing a bit of beta testing, let me know, and this might be available to people from in the hub over the next few weeks, I hope. And here are the references. So this is a very nice comprehensive survey of lots of the methods that I talked about today. And here are the references for precision homology and the mapper algorithm. Here are all the remaining references. Thanks for your attention.